Disclosure: I was invited by the Tank Museum at Bovington, the Panzer Museum Munster and the MH in Dresden in the previous years. Today we look at the T-34 in German service. Be aware this video is mostly footage since my hands have not fully healed yet and thus my mouse use is rather restricted at the moment. Big thank you to all my Patreon and Subscribestar supporters that allowed me to take a proper recovery time. The German army called enemy captured tanks that were reused by the German forces as Beutepanzer. But generally, captured tanks is used as translation. The word Beute can have several meanings, both loot and trophy are appropriate. Although if we want to be technically correct, it would be captured enemy tank that is repurposed for the German army. Since there is a difference between a captured tank, a Beutepanzer, and a Beutepanzer, in the sense that the latter is used in the German armed forces versus the former that was just captured and is not necessarily employed by the German forces, as pointed out by Jochen Vollert. The Germans used a lot of captured equipment even before the war. This included rifles, trucks and all other kinds of equipment. In terms of tanks, this number was initially rather low, with about 220 Czech tanks in the field army in 1939, namely the Panzer 35T and the Panzer 38T, which was less than 10%. Yet for Operation Barbarossa in 1941, that number had increased to 820, which is about 25%. Be aware that many of these tanks were technically not Beutepanzer in the strict sense, since they were produced in Czech factories that were occupied by the Germans. For a more in-depth look on Germans producing foreign weapons, see this video. The Germans created a system to classify enemy equipment by numbers in the origin. For instance, half-tracks were given a number starting with 300, whereas tanks used 700. This number was followed by a single letter in parentheses. For instance, B for Belgium, I for Italy, R for the Soviet Union, which was generally called Russia, thus the R. Be aware that the number was not a unique identifier. This means that without the letter in parentheses you cannot tell which tank was meant. To give you an example, the T-34 had the number 747. Yet this number was also used for the British Matilda 1 or the American M3 Lee. Yet in these cases the number was followed by an R for the T-34, an E for the Matilda, and then an A by the M3 Lee. Why E for the British? Because the Germans called them English. A short look at the development over the years. The German army in April 1940 established several units for locating, listing and gathering Polish equipment. This included everything from small arms, ammunition, manual spare parts and relevant raw materials as well. For Operation Barbarossa, this action was repeated, although already in the early days of the campaign, namely in early July 1941. Keep in mind that about 25% of the German tank forces consisted of Czech tanks at this moment and that the tank forces were considered elite. As such, the use of foreign equipment by German troops was not something out of the ordinary. A few days after this order, a new order was given for special tank platoons consisting of captured tanks, yet those should be used by the Sicherungsdivisionen, the security divisions that operated behind German lines. Now in 1941, the mainstay tank of the Red Army was the T-26, with about 4,200 T-26 variants stationed in the western districts. In comparison, for the T-34, this number was about 830. Yet in overall, the amount of captured T-34s that were used by the German force in 1941 was very low, according to the information available. This of course raises the question, why was this the case? Because we know also that German frontline officers called for copying the T-34 to be employed by the Germans. Well, there were several reasons for this. To properly capture and reuse a tank, you need to have the equipment to recover it, the proper tools, spare parts and mechanics to repair it. Generally, for recovering Soviet tanks in 1941, there's a report from November 1941 that stated that many tanks were too damaged in combat and could be only used for scrap. Additionally, that many that seemed apparently undamaged were missing important parts that were either taken by the Soviet troops or recovered by German troops. Particularly the KV-1 and KV-2 could not be recovered by German troops due to the weight of about 40 to 50 tons. Additionally, the German repair crews were already overburdened with repairing German equipment. Jentz notes that for all of 1941 only 16 T-26 and 15 BT tanks were repaired and employed by security divisions. Keep in mind that these tanks were far more common than the T-34. For the T-34 there were some specific reasons as well. The T-34 was heavier than any German tank in 1941. This means that the Germans did not have proper recovery vehicles. Additionally, these recovery vehicles would be part of the German tank divisions, yet those divisions generally pushed forward where the regular infantry divisions would be in control of the areas with the T-34 left behind. Additionally, the infantry divisions would not have the proper tools nor mechanics. Vollert points out that many captured tanks broke down due to wrong handling by German crews, and some units did not have the proper tools, as such their tanks operated with lower speeds. Jochen Vollert created a list of which German units you are using the T-34 over the course of the war. Although likely more captured tanks were used than reported, it is rather apparent that the number of captured tanks in frontline units was generally very small. Yet he also points out that based on the photographic evidence that more tanks were likely used than is documented in the various strength reports. Yet those photos generally show very few or single vehicles. Let us look at the German experience report about using the T-34. It notes in the beginning that handling Soviet tanks is rather difficult, and that 8 out of 9 T-34s had damaged gearboxes from improper driving by German drivers. Similar problems have happened with the clutch. For maintenance, they note that spare parts that are available are generally not new, but already used, and that wear and tear often can't be determined properly beforehand. Furthermore, the German tools are of limited use when repairing Soviet engines and weapons. It is also noted that during road marches halts had to be done regularly, and there were various problems with the steering clutches which would overheat rather easily. About the 76mm gun, it is noted that if it is properly aligned and tested, it has a high hit capability. Similarly with the machine guns, although the rate of fire was low, at the same time they had very few malfunctions. Whereas in terms of optical equipment, it is noted that it is subpar in comparison to German equipment. This refers both to the quality of the gunner sight as well as the limited amount of periscopes and vision devices. The issue of a 2-man turret of the T-34 instead of a 3-man turret like for the Panzer 3 or 4 is noted. The 2-man turret layout overtaxes the commander of the T-34 with firing and commanding duty, unlike in the German tanks where the commander was not employed as a gunner. They noted based on recent combat experience that using the T-34 with closed hatches in the attack is not recommended because running into trenches happened to both Soviet and German troops during attacks with closed hatches. It is thus recommended to use the T-34 in a tank destroyer role. Besides general orders and directives about captured equipment, there are a few instances that particularly refer to T-34s. Let us take a look at those. Probably the most important facility in terms of the T-34 for the Germans was the Kharkov locomotive factory. It was captured by the Germans in 1941 and used by the SS for completing T-34s that were already in production. Yet there is no indication that the production continued afterwards. Yet while I was in the German military archive, I stumbled across a file directory of the German Army Weapons Office. It contained an entry from December 1941 with the title Production Possibilities for Panzerkampfwagen T-34 in the Soviet Union. Sadly, I could not find the report itself, yet it shows that there was enough consideration given to producing the T-34 in the occupied areas of the Soviet Union to create a report on it. Later in the war, the Red Army was able to retake Kharkov. In the Third Battle of Kharkov in February to March 1943, the Germans recaptured Kharkov. This time, the factory was used to repair T-34s, yet even with a lot of spare parts and proper facilities, the number of operational tanks was rather low. Vollert notes that in May 1943, 25 T-34s were available, but only one was operational. In July 1943, out of 25 T-34s, 16 were made operational, which was the highest recorded number for this unit. Yet keep in mind that 16 tanks is less tanks than a complete German tank company had as an intended strength. In late July 1943, German Army High Command issued an order to centralize the collection of T-34s and its parts on the Eastern Front, namely at the Panzerinstandsetzungswerk tank repair facility Riga at the Latvian coast. Troops delivering such tanks would be rewarded, for instance, with 40 bottles of alcohol for a T-34. Sadly, not much else is known about this initiative. Now many German units employed T-34s during the war, in one way or another. From 1941 to 1945, Jochen Vollert notes 47 different units operating T-34s, yet most of them used only a handful or even a single vehicle. Vollert also states that about 500 to 600 T-34s likely served as Beutepanzer from 1941 to 1945, yet he does not really provide a source or argument for this number. Assuming this number is correct, the number of T-34s in German service is limited. To give you some numbers, in total the Germans produced about 29,000 tanks, not including Sturmgeschütze or self-propelled guns, from 1934 to 1945, whereas the Soviets produced about 57,000 T-34s of all variants from 1940 to 1945. From this information we can draw the following preliminary conclusions. First, even under the favorable conditions like spare parts and proper facilities being available, that the total number of operational T-34s was limited. Second, that the number of combat-ready T-34s employed by the Germans in units was rather limited, and as such the proper tactical employment and effect on the battlefield was also rather limited. Third, that the T-34 in German service was not uncommon, yet likely mostly only in low numbers and for a very short period of time due to combat losses and or lack of ability to repair the tank. I hope you learned something new. Thank you to Andrew for reviewing the script and providing additional remarks. Thank you to the Tank Museum at Beuringen, the Panzer Museum Munster and the MH in Dresden for inviting me. Special thanks to all my supporters for making trips to the museums and military archives possible. Thank you for watching and see you next time.